Real potential output is the level of real GDP an economy can achieve when its labor is employed at its natural level. Other factors go into determining potential output, like the level of capital in an economy and our productive capabilities. But for now, we'll focus on the level of employment as the primary independent variable. We care about potential output because it's going to be the fundamental barometer we use to determine what's happening with our macroeconomy. But that also requires understanding that the economy is cyclical. We're clearly not always operating at our potential. Sometimes we're above and below it. The latter was likely the case during the Great Depression. That economic tragedy was arguably a major influence upon the British economist named John Maynard Keynes. You can learn more about Keynesian School of Economic Thought in my brief summary of the U.S. economic history, but in 1936, Keynes published his groundbreaking book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, in which he argued that economies experience what we would describe as business cycles, because the level of employment is determined by the demand for goods and services in an economy. Less demand for goods meant less need to keep people employed, which in turn meant less income for households to spend to buy goods and services. You can see how this quickly becomes a death spiral, and so did Keynes. Actually, that was part of his larger argument in the general theory. To understand this, though, we need to model demand and the sources of demand in a macroeconomy, which is much larger than a single market. What better choice than aggregate demand? Aggregate demand, or AD, is part of the fundamental tool we use to model the macroeconomy, the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model, or ASAD model. Aggregate demand is a relationship between the value of the quantity of final goods and services demanded in the economy from the four primary sources of demand and the economy's price level. You won't be surprised to know that these four primary sources of demand are the same as the components of real GDP: households, personal consumption; firms, gross private investment; government purchases and net exports, or foreign demand after subtracting out domestic demand for foreign goods. The aggregate demand curve graphically shows this relationship between real GDP demanded and the price level. Before we graph this curve, though, a word of advice. The y-axis measures the price level, and it's usually denoted as an index number. It's probably easier to think of the ASAD model as modeling what could happen in the future for an economy depending on how inflation or deflation goes. Price level 1 in that case represents what would happen to real GDP if the price level remains the same between the base year and the year we're modeling. Similarly, a price level of 1.15 would represent what would happen to real GDP if the price level increases 15% between the base year and the year we're modeling. With that in mind, we can graph the relationship between the price level and real GDP demanded within an economy using the AD curve. You'll immediately notice that the AD curve slopes downward, similar to the slope of the demand curve in the supply and demand model. The reason that curve slopes down is because of the law of demand. The AD curve has a negative slope for a similar set of reasons related to expectations of rational behavior in response to changes in prices in the economy. For example, the wealth effect caused by declining prices means that people with real value in assets will be able to borrow against their assets and buy more than they could have previously. Basically, lower prices make people with wealth feel wealthier because the real value of assets has more buying power when prices start to drop. So we assume that the wealth effect from households' behavioral reaction to falling prices contributes in part to the downward slope of the aggregate demand curve. Another contributor to the downward slope is the interest rate effect from price changes. We'll get into more detail on why interest rates tend to follow price changes, but for now, appreciate that the cost of borrowing is related to the cost of other goods and services in the macroeconomy. Finally, because declining price levels make goods in our economy cheaper for us and anyone overseas buying from us, there's also the international trade effect. That contributes to the downward slope, assuming higher demand for exports is negatively correlated with the price level. Similarly to how a change in prices is reflected on the demand curve, a change in the price level of the economy causes movement along the aggregate demand curve, reflecting a change in the aggregate amount of goods and services demanded due to economy-wide price changes. On the other hand, a shift of the aggregate demand curve causes a change in the aggregate amount of goods and services demanded at any given price level. A shift is different from a change in the price level because the drivers of shifts in the aggregate demand curve are independent or otherwise unconnected to the price level. Changes in consumer confidence, business expectations, personal and corporate tax policy, government purchases, transfer payments and stimulus checks, income levels overseas, exchange rates, and sometimes changes in interest rates are all distinct from changes in price levels, and therefore can cause the AD curve to shift to the left or the right. Any change that happens to the four sources of demand has a multiplied effect on the economy's real GDP. This is because of the multiplier that is attributable at least partially to our fractional banking system. So if Congress passes a $2.5 trillion in discretionary spending to keep the U.S. economy afloat during a severe recession, we should expect real GDP to change by a different amount. Whether it's smaller or bigger amount depends on whether the multiplier is more or less than 1. Now, while the aggregate demand curve and the price level can tell us about the demand side of the economy, the supply side is the one that's actually involved in employment. So any determination of demand for goods and services is going to have to incorporate the willingness of firms to produce and sell that output. That's a challenge uniquely complicated by time. More on that next.